Hello everybody. Welcome to our local LAMP stack tour. I'm Dominic Thomas. I'm going to take you through a little background on what a LAMP stack is, and then we're going to go through the process of seeing what you will be installing and using on your own machine. To begin, the LAMP stack is an open source set of software. The acronym actually stands for the L of Linux, the A of Apache, the M of MySQL, and the P of PHP. These four things compose a hierarchical grouping of software that work together. So Linux is an operating system that's free and open source, very robust. We are actually not going to use Linux. We don't have to because most of you already have a Windows machine or a Mac machine, and that works just fine. On top of that, though, we're going to add the Apache web server. That's the software that allows web browsers to connect to a computer and interact and receive content. And then on top of that, or with that, we're going to add the MySQL database, which allows the web server to be much more dynamic and much more individualized, personalized. This is really a core enabler of data analytics and the data-driven economy. And additionally, we'll have the dynamic logic engine, the programming language. In this case, PHP. Some say PHP stands for personal home pages. Right now, everyone just refers to it as PHP. It's a very common language for programming on the web. And finally, we're going to add a Drupal framework. So the Drupal framework puts all of these pieces together and comes with a bunch of common workflows and processes that make it easier for us instead of starting from scratch. Now, because all of this is open source, we're actually drawing from giant communities who've developed this software over a long period of time. So, for example, we're looking at the Apache software community in a quick snapshot that I've gathered here. You can see if you were to visit their website that they've got information for newbies about where to start, how to behave. You can even go straight to the code. The whole point behind open source is that you can grab the code. And so you can see here also to the right, the motto, meritocracy in action. If you get involved and start doing things, you can become a core member of this community. There's no barrier. There are mentors out there, even local mentors available, especially here in Boston. So if you wanted to start getting involved, you can see they suggest where you can start, kinds of things you could start doing even on day one. You can see, too, that the majority of the code for this web server is written in Java, and that there are a few other languages there. So if you've taken a Java class, you already know enough to do something. At least you can read the code and start to understand it. And finally, I've pulled this chart down at the bottom that dates all the way back to 1995. You can see that over time this web server has grown in popularity to the point that today there are more than 175 top-level projects in this community. And within each project, there may be hundreds of members. So there are thousands and thousands of programmers developing this web server. The same thing is the case with our other OpenStack technologies we're using. Drupal, PHP, MySQL, they all have communities that back them up, and there's an ability for you to get involved and see exactly how they run, add to them, edit them, see what the bugs are. This is the great advantage of open source software. We've got complete access. All right. So how do we get this software on our computer? You're using a Windows machine or a Mac probably. If you're using Linux, you're going to have to follow a different method to participate in this part of our course. There is another method actually identified in the textbook Drupal 7 for installing a LAMP stack directly. We're not going to use that method if you have Windows or Mac because the Acquia DevDesktop provided by Acquia Company, which is just around the corner from us, actually makes this very easy. So go ahead and install that DevDesktop. I'll walk you through that in a moment. Before you do that, notice first of all of this software is free. If you had to do this by scratch, or if you had to follow some other instruction, such as installing it using Microsoft's proprietary web server, which I've done, it takes a lot more time. So the Acquia DevDesktop is not going to install an operating system. It's going to install on top of Windows or Mac. It's going to install Apache MySQL, PHP, and with MySQL and with Apache, it's also going to give us the ability to use HTML, JavaScript, SQL, and actually a few other things that we don't need to worry about. And finally, it's going to add a couple of extra things, the Acquia Cloud Services for Drupal that we might use much later in our semester. And notice it supports two different kinds of publishing workflows. We're going to experiment with both of those later this semester too because they are at the root of how you understand enterprise systems development today. And given that our course is about systems acquisition and management, we need to understand those core methods, Git and SFTP. So we'll see both of those a little bit later in our class. So to install the DevDesktop, you can go to dev.acquia.com/downloads, and you'll see there's a Mac download and a Windows download. Click on that, download it, double-click it, accept the default settings. Of course, if you need to pause this video at any point, please do. If you're on Windows and you're using the firewall, it's going to prompt you whether to allow the Apache web server to run on private networks such as home or work network, and you should allow it to. Okay? So allow it to run on all networks. Frankly, it's only going to run on your machine. You're not going to be serving web pages out to the rest of the world, so you really don't have to worry about this. But in case you wanted to share with a friend or something like that, it's better to allow it. It's going to be contained on your machine though, so there's no danger in allowing it. Once you've installed the DevDesktop and started it, it's going to prompt you with this screen in the upper left that asks you whether you want to start from scratch, and the answer is yes. Start from scratch. I don't have an existing Drupal site. Once you click that button, it's going to give you a listing of different Drupal variations that you can install. Scroll down until you see Acquia Drupal, and to the right there will be a button that says Install version 7. Whatever the current exact variation is. Click that Install button, or link I should say. Once you click that link, it's going to prompt you with some settings for the local code base folder, local site name, local URL. I just went ahead and accepted these. Because I had two different Acquia DevDesktops on my machine, I added a little bit to my URL here. It says users, Dominic Thomas sites, Win DevDesktop. I added the Win part because I'm running on a machine that has Mac and Windows, and I wanted to be able to distinguish the two. And then I clicked Finish. After you click Finish, you get a screen like the one to the bottom right here, where it says it's extracting the Drupal archive. It's actually downloading the code from a website online, so you have to have internet connection, obviously, and it will run through the process of doing that installation. Once you have done the installation and you start the Dev Desktop, you will see that you now have a Drupal site called Acquia Drupal, and it's got a number here. We could have actually renamed it to make it easier for us, but the default setting is nice because it reminds us exactly which variation of Drupal we've got. To the right, we're also going to see that when that site is highlighted in the Dev Desktop screen, it gives us a link to the actual local site. I'm not going to click that yet for a reason which you'll understand in a minute. I want to have a blank log in Apache before we start. There's also the local code link. So that's a link to the actual code that we're using. And that's pretty handy because all of this web framework can be edited by us, and it's on our own machine. That's important because we're learning about management and code management, and the ability to control your code is a real issue today for enterprise IT architects and CIOs. And finally, our local databases here. We can see we've got a little control of our settings. We can change the PHP version. But under the Acquia DevDesktop menu item, we can actually do a lot more than that. We're going to see that. There are a couple other little things to note. There's a terminal button here that gets us into the terminal for the command line. We may use that a little bit right now. We're going to use it a lot more later this semester because in systems management, using the terminal is still the default. There are a lot of different capabilities you can't access through standard software interfaces that you can access in the terminal. Finally, down at the bottom, look at these green dots. The Dev Desktop is telling us that Apache is currently running effectively, and so is MySQL. That's what those green dots mean. We could stop the web server and its services if we wanted to, but we need to know that they're running so that we can go ahead with our tour. Okay, so for our tour, we're going to look at a few things. We're going to look at the web server itself and its configuration. Same with MySQL and PHP. We're going to look at logs a little bit just to see that they're there and have an idea of what might be in there of interest or how people might use them. We might also note here that during the installation process, it told us where our stack is. So the actual application software exists on our machine, and we can see where that is. We can see that there are ports being used. Ports are the numerical connectors that software uses to communicate. So if you've got two pieces of software like the Apache server and MySQL, MySQL makes itself available on port 33067 in our setup here, as I show on the screen. And so Apache is going to connect to MySQL by calling through that port. It's like an address. Port numbers matter. They are pretty much standardized. Port 80 is the World Wide Web. So on a local development machine, sometimes you'll see port 8083 or 8080 or 8085, or various variations of that. And what's happening there is that it's making a port that is traceable to World Wide Web but private. A lot of the lower numbered ports are actually well-known standards, and so anything above, say, 1,000 is a little bit more private and harder for hackers to get into. And so a lot of the time on a development machine, automatically they'll use higher port numbers. The final port number we see there is 443 for the HTTP Hypertext Transfer Protocol secure variation. That's for the secure socket layer, and that's also a pretty standard port number, 443 in any case. And so the 8 makes it a hidden development type port. Web crawlers wouldn't automatically be able to see it. And to the right, we see also the version numbers. We'll see a little bit more of that. But sometimes the versions matter, and so as we were installing Drupal, it showed us these version numbers, and the DevDesktop did. And we know that we're on the Apache server version 2. We see we're on MySQL 5. We have PHP, various types of PHP, PHP 5, and out to the right, notice we've got PHP 7, which is a huge improvement in PHP. And we may take a look at that at some point in this semester. Okay, so without further ado, let's take a quick look. And to begin, let's have a look at configurations. So I'm going to click my DevDesktop menu, and I'm going to go to Preferences. Now, by default, it's saying put in your name. You actually should go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and put in my name, and I'm going to put in my email address here. And the reason this matters is that it gets used for logging who did what. I'm going to click on ports. We can change our ports. Notice it tells us the number range for ports, but we're going to go ahead and keep them as is for now because there's no need to change them. If I go over to the Config tab here, I can see that not only is it telling me where the configuration files are. So for Apache, the configuration file is called HTTP D. D is for daemon or daemon. And that's a type of software that's running in the background and handles requests. Typically, server software on Linux has these little D's at the end. And so MySQL's actual software name is MySQL D. The configuration file doesn't say that. It says my.cnf. But if I'm actually using the command prompt, that's what it's doing. There's a variable we're setting here, the PHP mode. We're going to see a little bit of that in the configuration file. We'll see that we're set for fast CGI. That's actually a way of having Apache handle PHP. I'm going to click on Edit here to open up this httpd.conf file. And when I do that, Notepad opens. What I'm looking at is the file that tells Apache how to operate. And we've got the ability to edit this thing right here. Now, if I were running a server out in a server farm, there would still be one of these files, perhaps split into several pieces, but they would all be there, and we'd have all these options, and we would very carefully manage this file. All of these pound symbols on the left say that these are comments. So some of this should make sense to you based on your experience with programming. I'm going to scroll down, and as I scroll down, we're going to see different things. So let me get my server up here, the window a little smaller. Right off the bat, it tells me where the actual software is. So the Apache server root, there it is. If I installed another Apache server and I wanted to use it, I could change that here. As I scroll down, I see that it's telling it to listen on these ports. As you might imagine, if we change those port numbers in the DevDesktop, this is where it would save that information to actually make it change for the web server. And then after it did that, it would restart the web server. Notice too that you can customize. If you wanted to force Apache to only listen on a specific IP address and a specific port on that IP address, we can constrain it that way. So a lot of companies, if they have an internal web server, they'll do that. Down below, it's telling us about the kinds of libraries that we're supporting. So we can see here that we're allowing various things like aliases. There's a lot of different capabilities in Apache. This set of default listings is not the complete set possible in Apache. In fact, there are many, many more possible statements here. So sometimes if you wanted to extend your web server, you might need to type in and add additional load module statements. In some cases, the statement might be here, but just commented out, so you might actually need to uncomment it, as in this authentication digest module. This is a special authentication method. We don't need it right now, so we can just leave things as is. But there are all kinds of modules. So for example, if we were using Light Directory Access Protocol, LDAP, to log in our users, we might need to enable LDAP. There's all sorts, and then we would of course save it and restart the web server, and that would make the new library available for Apache so that we could communicate with an LDAP provider. There's a lot of different pieces here. You might know a few of them. Notice too, with LDAP, we might have to turn on this module down here, so there might be several. There are help files online. You can read about how to enable LDAP on Apache, and they'll tell you the different pieces and different methods. As with just about everything open source, there are different methods to doing almost anything you're doing. And so sometimes you might have different options. There are other things here, so notice it's looking for that variable PHP FCGI. If it's defined, then it's saying go ahead and load this FCGI module. So it doesn't load it by default. If you went back up this list, you'll see that module was there. It's only loading it if we decided to use that FCGI method, which we did in the DevDesktop. So that variable is getting passed to the Apache server, and it's deciding to use FCGI, which is the fast common gateway. If that's not defined, then it uses the standard modules for PHP serving, which are a little slower, just different methods. If you want to read about that, you could. There are a lot of other options here. I encourage you to read through the configuration file just to become familiar with what a web server does and how it operates. For security reasons, on production servers, people will change the standard user for Apache, and make it into something specific, a limited user that can only run the web server. That's what this does. Down here, you might put your personal email address in. You don't need to, because we're only going to be on our own machines. But in a production web server, we would definitely do that, because any errors or problems would get emailed so that we could immediately fix the web server. This is kind of important. Under ServerName, this is the only name on which our web server will respond. Now, we could have aliases. We could have a web server that responds to a bunch of different URLs. But in our case, we're just running on our local system. And the way that we know that's true is that we see this URL here, which is an IP address, 127.0.0.1. That is called the loopback address. It is a standard set address for a computer to call itself for web requests or any other request to be served by itself. The loopback address, the loopback IP address. And so our web server is set to only respond to itself. It's not going to respond to any calls from the outside. No computer can reach our computer on 127.0.0.1. So this is actually a core security setting for our Acquia DevDesktop. And it ensures that our Apache server will not respond to anyone outside of our own machine. Okay, down below there's a few other kinds of security settings here where it says when someone accesses a directory. Now, a directory is just a file folder on our computer. So when someone comes to a file folder, it's telling it by default, don't allow any overwriting and deny everybody. And then later it's going to allow, and so by default, don't let anyone do anything. And then it's going to allow specific permissions. So it's very common from a security perspective to have a statement like this on a web server. Web security becomes very important for enterprise systems management. Later on, we're going to actually tell specific things that we're going to allow it to do. We're saying we have a document root here at DevDesktop, and that it's okay to visit that particular. Notice there's another directory setting here, and this is allowing us to visit that particular directory. So different options for this particular directory. So that's how we're saying we're setting it. And require local. So people have to be local to access it. So there's a lot going on here inside of our configuration folder. This piece tells Apache what kinds of files to give a browser by default for processing. And so DirectoryIndex, index.php, that's what Drupal uses. If there's no index.html file, then Apache will give an index.php file. If we put both in one file folder or directory, it'll actually give the index.html first because it's listed first. We could, in fact, delete this for our purposes. We could delete the index.html. However, if you wanted to use your local stack for development and you wanted to write your own index.html files, you want to leave that there. If you wanted to add other things like Java or Ruby or other languages, you would add those index files here so that by default they would get served. Okay? There's a lot of other things here. It tells you where your logs are. It tells you the nature of how it's going to do the logging. We can choose different log modes. There is an awful lot going on in an Apache server configuration file. I'm going to scroll quickly down. The log format is here. We can customize it. The aliases, we do have the alias module turned on. There's something really cool going on in Drupal that the alias module does. We'll see a little bit more about that down here. And so if I keep going down, it's telling me MIME types are actually file types. And so Apache is enabled here to process files. And so if it gets compressed files, it can sense them and then handle them. So here are the statements that tell it that if it gets a PHP file, send it to the PHP handler. If it gets a compressed file, TGZ or zip file or gzip file, to send it to the gzip application. So those are sort of the mappings. There are a lot of other ones you could turn on or enable in this particular space. We don't need to worry about them at the moment. There are other settings we could turn on that allow change the timeout configuration. Notice lots of things are actually commented out here. We're not using a proxy, so this doesn't matter to us, but if we needed to, then we could do that here. SSL is set up, but we're not going to be using it for now. Down here, we can see a little bit more. There is some software in addition to the Drupal DevDesktop, which we saw that directory statement earlier. There's one other thing that got installed with the DevDesktop. It's called phpmyadmin, and this directory statement says that if you go to this alias, phpmyadmin, go ahead and serve up everything from here. That's important because if you didn't have this here, then Drupal would handle that URL. Okay? There are a couple of other things going on. There's a vhosts if we had different names, different virtual hosts in our server. We don't. We can change that. So I haven't changed anything. I'm just going to close this file. We're going to walk over and take a look at our MySQL configuration file. This is a lot shorter. by default it has no returns in it, so I'm going to go ahead and put a few in just to make it a little clearer. There are a few things happening here. We can see the port setting. That's where the DevDesktop would change it. We can see that Acquia DevDesktop has set our MySQL to respond to a user called Drupal user. We can see a few other settings, like the maximum size of data transferred is set at 128 megabytes. If we were using larger data blocks, we could actually increase that here. We could change the ports. We could also change some of the settings. Here's that MySQL D. Notice these are the configurations that pass to the actual MySQL server software, and there are a bunch of things. So you can read through those if you want. We don't really need to read them all. There are a lot of them in a giant string. It's basically a bunch of configuration variable settings that we can edit and control because the server is on our machine. I'm not going to save the returns I just added. I don't need to. We'll take one look at our PHP settings as well. So I'm going to go ahead and hit edit here. The DevDesktop is giving us access to an awful lot. The PHP settings are written in a different style, different language than the Apache settings. So the comment method is actually the semicolon. A little bit different. It really doesn't make much difference, though. You can understand that it's a comment because it's basically the same thing. It's still a single character out at the front, and it's clear that these are comments. So you should be able to understand that very quickly, just based on your experience with programming already. I'm scrolling down. Reading through this file might be very interesting for you. This one's also pretty long, but if you read it, it won't take you but probably 20, 30 minutes. And it'll give you a pretty thorough understanding of how a web server can be configured for a dynamic scripting language. That's what PHP is. So I'm going to go ahead and go down a little bit faster, and we're just going to take a look at some of the things that are uncommented. So let's go ahead and scroll down. Everything is commented out so far. There are a lot of options possible in PHP. This php.ini file stands for initialize or initialization. So it is the configuration file that PHP uses to initialize itself. It can be customized even for an individual website by if the configuration allows it, you can put your own php.ini file inside of a specific website directory, and in some servers that'll allow you to customize the behavior of PHP even for a specific website. So it doesn't have to be universal to every website on one web server. It can be customized to an individual. The engine is on. So notice if this setting were changed, all of a sudden PHP scripting in Apache would turn off. So this particular setting is quite important. There's a lot of other stuff. ASP tags, that's deprecated. We don't do that anymore, but if you wanted to allow some configuration to work with active server pages from Microsoft, there are ways to make PHP work with that. Buffering, if you're getting buffer overruns and you needed a higher buffer, you can set that here. Notice this is a maximum size in bytes. So basically our output buffer is 4K. So for production systems, sometimes that buffer needs to be larger because you've got certain reasons. It doesn't matter to us. Output compression, these are kinds of issues that matter for performance. We're not going to get much into performance management right now, but some of the settings in this file allow you to really customize how performance with your scripting language works with PHP. So I'm going to keep going down. We're going to run into a few other things here. There's a few little pieces along the way. Okay. Zend enable. This actually allows a couple of different behaviors. They don't particularly matter to us at the moment, so we don't need to worry about it. Okay? Expose the fact that PHP is installed. Because we're on a development server, we definitely want to do that. It allows our dev desktop to know what's going on with PHP. The maximum execution time. Sometimes when you're developing a website, you are writing some content that's not optimized yet, and sometimes your code takes a long time, but it actually is running. But you'll get a timeout error in your tests on your browser. And so sometimes you might need to change this execution time. Similarly, there's a max input time. There's also a max memory. So there's a memory limit of 256 megs. So sometimes you might want to increase that on a dev environment because it's going to make a big difference in terms of whether you can see if your code is working or not. There's a bunch of stuff here about log and error reporting. We can just leave those as is. There are ways to actually automatically pump the errors out verbosely to the web browser when you try out your code. There's a lot of different pieces here. Sometimes I do turn that on, by the way. And sometimes I actually will turn the manual on. So down here where it says allow the PHP manual, sometimes I will turn that on so that if I'm doing something funky with PHP, something on the edge of my understanding, I can quickly get that open source documentation, which is quite extensive, and fix what I'm doing instantly. And what's one of the nice things about using PHP is that it will allow us to very quickly understand what's going on. Data handling, there are a lot of other pieces in here. I'm just going to quickly scroll down so that we can, there's no doc root defined. We're allowing it to serve from any place, but for security purposes, we might define a doc root on a public server. Notice file uploads are on. So later on, some of you are going to run into this problem. PHP in our development environment is allowed to handle PHP file uploads and downloads. But when you start running on a web server hosted by your company or hosted on Bluehost or hosted on Acquia, that is probably not the case because of security concerns. And so you're going to have to use their workflow or their method to put files onto a web server. You won't have any choice. It's a security issue. Now earlier we saw that the Dev Desktop supports SFTP and Git-based workflows. This actually is a constraint on a workflow. An HTTP file upload is a type of workflow for development. You'll see that Drupal actually allows easy updating using this method by just clicking some buttons inside of the modules interface in the admin panels. But because on other web servers this isn't allowed for security reasons, you're going to have to learn how to use Git or SFTP or FTP to move files onto the server and be able to try out new code. So we're going to be doing that this semester, but just note that that's where this setting is. It's here in the php.ini. And there's some other pieces, max upload size, etc. Okay, I'm going to close that out. We've really gone pretty far. We've seen almost everything. We can see that there's a different settings file for each version of PHP, so we can really customize. We've got logs. I'm just going to visit one log. Let's go to the Apache access log. It's blank because our server's never done anything. Now for fun, I'm going to move this over. I'm going to come back over. I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to click this local site button. Now you're going to be installing your Drupal site. And the very first time you click this button, it's going to start configuring Drupal on your local machine. Now for me, I'm running on Windows 10, and it's opening it up. in Internet Explorer. You can see that down here. By default, it's already chosen the profile, which is the Acquia Drupal 7 profile. It's chosen the language. It automatically ran in English. It's verified the requirements, so it made sure it had MySQL and Apache, and it checked which versions. It made sure there's PHP. It set up the database. It had permission already. If we weren't using the DevDesktop, there'd be an awful lot to do up to this point. And it's going ahead and installing a bunch of stuff. Because we're using the Acquia DevDesktop's Acquia Drupal 7 version, there are some extra modules, like the Acquia agent we see here. It's adding those. It's adding 33 additional modules and pieces. It's now installed all of those, so you're watching in real time. I've now installed a Drupal site. I'm going to leave the site name while I can, or I can go ahead. I think my instructions to you are to put your own name in, to put your own email address in. So I'll go ahead and do that. We don't have an Acquia subscription, so we'll leave that blank. I'm going to set my site username to site admin. You could make it something else if you want to. I would suggest that you go ahead and do that. This is a good habit because this is the site maintenance account. It's actually the superuser. Now, as far as passwords go ahead and set something that you're going to remember. So in my case, I have some simple ones I use for development purposes. I'm going to go ahead and use one of those. I need to remember I used the username site admin. If you can't remember that, go ahead and write it down to help yourself. I'm going to jump down to my country in here. My time zone is already set. I'll allow it to check for updates and receive email notifications. I'll hit save and continue. Up in the URL, I can see that my web server is calling this install.php file. It's now done, and I'm going to click Visit My New Site. There we go. So I am running on my local web server, and I'm running on port 8083. Now if I go back, let's go back over to the DevDesktop. Okay. And this time I want to go back to Preferences. I want to go to Logs. And I want to visit my Apache access log. Holy smokes. Look at that. Now, because I just did all of this installation, there's a lot of stuff here. And so I can scroll down. I can see what happened. I can see exactly what happened, what the Apache server did. These are all post calls, which means in terms of a method, that they're all get calls, which means it was just getting stuff and sending it to the browser. It wasn't actually receiving data from me. It did actually take a little data from me for the profile. That's where I set those variables. It received that data. So it's telling me a bunch of stuff here. So, of course, admins and enterprise managers will use these logs. There are different softwares. We can actually view the logs for Apache, MySQL. There's a slow query log for MySQL. Very handy for debugging if things are going slow. The last thing I want to look at is this local database. When I click this link, notice it's using that phpmyadmin directory. And it's taking me into, by default, the database of my new site that I just created. Now, Drupal is a data-driven web framework. It allows you to instantly have thousands of web pages that are based on data. If you had to hard code all of these web pages, it would take a very long time. But instead, there's a database behind Drupal that determines what a visitor sees and all the options, all the permissions, etc. That makes it very dynamic. It allows us to do a lot more than if we had to do it ourselves. On this very first load of phpmyadmin, you may run into a delay, as it does its initial configuration. We're going to have to wait a minute as it installs. And once it actually loads, we're going to see that we have access to the database server, at least a lot of it, a lot more than we would have without any kind of fat client or software for managing. The other method, of course, would be to drop into the shell or command prompt on the computer and send commands directly to MySQL. You also notice in the URL here that it's referring to localhost or semicolon 8083. That's another way to reference the web server. Localhost is the alias for the loopback or 127.0.0.1. I should mention too that earlier when we visited our Drupal site, it went to Acquia Drupal-7-54-64-6338.dd or DevDesktop. That's an alias. When we installed this Drupal website inside of our DevDesktop, the DevDesktop created this alias and registered it with Apache. So at this point, Apache is responding to a few different aliases. Again, those are specifically delimited. Otherwise, they wouldn't be available. So again, earlier we saw in our settings that there were limits. Now it's looking to me like we're getting a hang in Internet Explorer. So I'm actually going to copy this URL and see if I can pull up another web browser. So let's try the Edge browser just for fun. And I'm going to paste and go. See if maybe the Edge browser is actually a little more effective. Oh, I guess I was using the Edge browser. For some reason, my phpmyadmin does not seem to be loading. So let's pause for a moment. Oh, there it is. Finally it loaded. We notice we've got a bunch of stuff here. We've got the server reference. We've got a specific database. So we're in this database now, but if I click back, I have the ability to see everything going on the server itself. So I just clicked back on the server. If I click now onto databases, I think it's actually still processing my request. Let's see if I can get it to go. So it's showing me what's inside of my database, this particular database. Let's see if I can get it to respond. Nope. Didn't seem to want to respond there. Maybe that's a Microsoft Edge browser problem. I can see there are 15 rows of data here. I can actually run SQL here. I can import data and export it to this database. Let's go ahead and go down for a second just to see something that looks familiar. All of this, these are all data tables. They are all installed. They were installed by Drupal. They're being used by the Drupal software to run Drupal. We can see the size. We could actually see, we ran into a little error there. We can see if there's overhead in a table, so we can see if things are running slow. I'm going to go down to the users table. This will be the last thing we do. See if I can get the users table to load. I don't see it loading there. It looks like you may need to use Chrome in order to get the phpmyadmin to work more effectively. There are triggers, events. There are a lot of things you can add to MySQL. You can control all of that here. In the users table, If you come down to it and you click Browse, and you look inside it, you'll notice there are 2 rows there. You'll see that user ID 1 is actually set up as the user we just created, site admin, and that's it. So we've got the ability to manage our database right here inside of our new LAMP stack. We've got a working web server. We've got a working database server. When you're done, you can go ahead and hit stop, and that will shut it down. And you now have a development environment on your own machine. Congratulations.